Well, good afternoon and welcome to the CWI Media broadcasts. And of course, we're broadcasting again against the background of a deepening health crisis as far as the neo-colonial world is concerned, a devastating situation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We see the development of further economic crisis in a whole series of countries. And of course, we're also seeing major developments taking place in the United States following the election of Joe Biden as president, the defeat of Donald Trump. And of course, that has crucial implications for the situation domestically in the US and of course, as far as world relations itself is concerned. And that's what we'll be discussing today. But before we go on to have that discussion, we'd like to encourage all of our viewers to join us by looking at our website at socialistworld.net. And we'd also like you to go to our YouTube channel, CWI Media, and subscribe to that if you haven't done so already, because that will help boost our audience pool. So turning now to the United States, we'd like to welcome three distinct comrades from the Independent Socialist Group in the US. That's Comrade Jeff Booth. Welcome to Jeff. Elisabeth Wichser. Welcome to Elisabeth. And Sam Skinner as well. Welcome to Sam. So I think really there's two aspects of the situation we need to feature today. If we look at the US, it's domestic situation and then what's taking place as far as the international position of US imperialism is concerned. And maybe we could begin with Sam, because we've seen the election of Biden. He's launched a whole series of stimulus packages, of infrastructure packages, involving trillions of dollars. I think we're on the fourth stimulus package now in total. It's an incredible amount of investment that they're putting in. It's the biggest package that we've seen of state intervention in the US since Roosevelt's New Deal, as many would commentate on that. And some, of course, have drawn direct analysis to that. So maybe, Sam, you could begin the discussion today by outlining the question of the stimulus packages, the question of the infrastructure program, and what they mean and what impact they've had and are likely to have on US society. And in particular, maybe you could address the question, will they solve the crisis facing the US economically and socially, as indeed some capitalist commentators are already arguing. So the floor is yours, Sam, to maybe begin our discussion.
Yeah, it's a good question, Tony. So with the vaccine now widely available in the US and things going back to kind of, quote unquote normal, there's certainly a mood in the air in the country that the US is emerging out of the crisis that COVID-19 helped create. But that's really not the case. The current crisis is far from over. Record numbers of working people lost their jobs during the height of the pandemic, and while some are finding work again, the rate of unemployment has settled at around 5.9%, which is still much higher than the pre-COVID level of around 3.5%. And so, Joe Biden campaigned on a third stimulus bill. So there's only been three so far. And he campaigned on that being $2,000 for every American. And so once he was elected, that was immediately lowered to $1,400. And so Biden did, increase the child tax credit, sending direct payments to parents. It's really still not enough for most people. And one poll found that 6 in 10 Americans didn't think their stimulus money would be able to last them more than 3 months. In addition, to look at some of the other statistics that are a little shocking coming out of this current crisis, one found that the life expectancy of Black and Latino Americans, some of the poorest Americans in the country, is at its lowest level since the Second World War. So there's a real sense for many working people that the Biden administration stimulus is inadequate. But like I said before, right, you have this massive relief with the COVID-19 vaccines coming out, with people being able to go out again, not wear masks. And that's being, kind of betted on by the ruling class to, I think, distract a lot of working people from the economic conditions that we're all still suffering under. But this post-COVID, post-vaccine euphoria, it can't last forever, and it can't undo the crisis that we're in. Unless there's a fourth stimulus, and this stimulus would have to be, even larger than the ones before, people's anger is going to bubble over soon. And the Biden administration has really signaled that they are not looking to do a fourth stimulus. And now in terms of the infrastructure bill, this is a multi-billion-dollar bill some forms of it are even, a few $1 trillion. It would cover everything from roads to bridges to action against climate change. The Biden administration is really pushing this as well as, this is their climate change bill. This is how they're going to get stuff done on that. Like you said, it's being lauded by, a lot of the political class and the corporate media as, this massive thing, the biggest thing since the Green New Deal. However, when you look under the hood of the bill, it's hardly as remarkable as people say, especially when it comes to combating climate change. A lot of mainstream environmentalist groups, like the Sunrise Movement in the US, these are groups that supported Biden, really bought into the lesser evilism, against Trump. They're pretty angry at how little is in this bill, especially since Biden made a lot of big promises around cutting carbon emissions and investing in green infrastructure. The Democrats are, promising that they're going to have more bold climate policies in a second bill they're going to pass. And this second bill is also going to fund other aspects of Biden's first climate bill. But, from what people are saying, on the inside, it doesn't look like this is very likely to actually happen. Of course, Biden was never going to take climate change seriously. That would involve working against the interests of the corporate polluters who put him in office. However, this could be a good moment to try and draw away some of the disillusioned layers of, young people who are in the climate movement and draw them towards the only effective fight back against climate change, which is the socialist fight back. And so while Biden's infrastructure bill, will create jobs, will repair some of the, really criminally poorly maintained roads and bridges in this country, those who are going to benefit most from this are the capitalist class. Biden's administration is intending to use, what they call asset recycling to fund this bill, which basically means that public utilities are going to be rented out to private companies who are then going to operate them for profit. So this is going to result, most likely in the de facto privatization of many of America's roads, airports, and public utilities. One good example is that they're talking about, renting out the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a very famous, power plant built during the New Deal. So, comparing this bill to the New Deal is kind of silly in a lot of ways. As well, the infrastructure bill still has to make it through the Senate, where both Democrats and Republicans have made it clear that, a lot of things are going to have to be removed from it to get it passed. So while the bill that has made it through the House, doesn't look, horrible, it's still totally inadequate. The bill that's going to make it through the Senate is probably going to be even more underwhelming than the current one. Clearly the Biden administration is really anxious to dispense with the kind of semi-Keynesian policies of the pandemic and get back to the neoliberal austerity, which has been a constant over the past several administrations. If the Biden administration was really on the side of the working class, his infrastructure bill would include a rapid transition to publicly owned green energy, robust public transportation like high-speed rail networks, but instead the bill is focusing on pleasing Wall Street and building, more electric charging stations for the ruling class to charge their, Teslas at. So to sum up, Tony, and really answer the question, no, Biden's stimulus bills or his infrastructure bill really offer working people no way out of the COVID-19 crisis.
No, I think that's an important point you raise there, Sam. I mean, as you said, of course, through some of it, even if it's a reduced infrastructure program gets through the Senate, which they do look like they're going to cut back what Biden has proposed thus far. But nevertheless, as you say, it will create some jobs, and it's bound to have a certain effect for a layer, but it's not going to resolve the underlying social problems. And it is far smaller. There are elements, it seems to me, similar to the New Deal, but it's much smaller. It's not, percentage-wise, it is not in that sense comparable. But now maybe we could turn to Elisabeth, because there's important points here, which Sam partly touched on, and that was the question of the Democrats proposing this, so Biden proposed it. Some of the Democrats even have questioned whether the infrastructure bill goes too far. But what's the situation with the so-called left on the Democrats? How's Bernie Sanders reacted to this? And what's happening with the squad? How do they view young people view the question of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America? And the point that we were touching on informally before we started the broadcast, the recent election results in New York, which of course where AOC represents, and nevertheless the moderates, so-called, or really the right wing of the Democrats, appear to have emerged on top. So what does that point to? Maybe Elisabeth maybe has a few thoughts on that aspect of the political situation in the US.
Definitely. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think, since Sanders really came on the scene in 2016 talking about a political revolution, he has since basically abandoned that project. Earlier in the year, him as well as other quote unquote progressive Democrats tried and failed to push through a $15 an hour national minimum wage law in a COVID relief package. And since then, he's been spending a lot of his time helping former campaign staffer and Democrat Nina Turner win a special election in Ohio, which is coming up in November of this year. And Turner, supposedly supports Medicare for all, like many of the other people in the squad, but is running in a party funded by huge for-profit healthcare and insurance companies who would never let that happen. So like in 2020, for example, healthcare companies donated over $4.5 million to Republicans and Democrats, but 2.3 million of that, so about half, went to the Democrats. DSA and other socialist organizations have endorsed Turner, despite the fact that she's running in a capitalist party. This is not surprising from organizations like DSA, who are still trying to reform the Democratic Party, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But Turner and John Kasich wrote an article, the former governor of Ohio wrote an article for CNN in 2020 called, quote, "We know policing can be made more just because we did it." But then later that year, 16-year-old Makia Bryant was shot dead by police in Columbus, Ohio, after calling for help, and there's been no reprimand at all for the cop who killed her. The cop who killed her was actually defended by Democrats in the local Ohio government and by the police chief. They defended him by saying, oh, well, he was just responding as he was trained to do. But back to Sanders really quickly. Sanders supports Biden and recently said in an op-ed about the Israel-Palestine conflict, quote, "With the new president, the United States now has the opportunity to develop a new approach to the world, one based on justice and democracy. Whether it is helping poor countries get the vaccines they need, leading the world to combat climate change, or fighting for democracy and human rights around the globe, the United States must lead by promoting cooperation over conflict." And from this quote, it's very clear that he's living in a complete fantasy land. The U.S. has been hoarding vaccines since the vaccines were unrolled, and the U.S. only recently announced that they would send 80 million vaccines to countries in need, but there's no, those countries haven't been defined. We don't know where they're going. We don't know when they will get there. There hasn't been any plan behind that big announcement. And a recent article in the journal Nature said that most vaccines won't arrive in the neo-colonial world until 2023. Only 1% of global vaccines so far have gone to the neo-colonial world. He can say that that's happening. It's not currently happening. It's going to take a long time for it to happen, likely. In terms of climate change, I won't repeat, Sam has already gone into this, but, the ocean is literally on fire right now because of climate change. And the U.S. has no plans of, changing or challenging the systematic drivers of climate change. Sanders' point on the United States fighting for democracy and human rights is also laughable, which, we can touch on a little later talking about, U.S. imperialism, but that's not going to change. Biden is an imperialist, just like every president before him has been. And the squad, which have made headlines in the past year for not fighting for Medicare for all when they had somewhat of a chance, So, we obviously think that in order to pass legislation or get reforms, there has to be a movement on the ground. Very little happens without pressure from below. But there was an opportunity for the squad to try to force a vote on Medicare for all when they had to vote to confirm Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They could have withheld their vote and forced a vote on Medicare for all, and kind of used that little power that they had, but they didn't. They just voted her in with no strings attached. And they also failed to get support in the Democratic Party for the national $15 an hour minimum wage law. The national minimum wage has been $7.25 for 12 years, so since 2009. And since then, prices have continued to climb. The economy has again entered into a crisis triggered by COVID. It's not enough. It's not enough. 15 now is still not enough. We've been calling for $15 an hour for at least 5 years, if not more. Now really what's needed is 20, in some places 25, to really be able to not live so precariously. And so unfortunately the effects of the squad and Sanders continuing to try to work within the Democratic Party means that there's a legitimization of the idea that the Democratic Party can be reformed, that it can pass laws for the people, quote unquote. The squad and Sanders talk about issues that are meaningful to working people, but they can't and they won't fight for those issues systematically, and they won't, build a mass movement. When Sanders had the chance to, continue with the momentum that he had built in 2016, he channeled all of that into supporting Hillary Clinton and into the Democratic Party. The capitalist class, which the Democratic Party is a puppet of the capitalist class, they're not going to give us Medicare for all. They won't defund the police. They won't take, serious action on climate change, because all of these things challenge capitalism, challenge the bottom line, profits for the capitalist class. And so, that also, connects to the recent election in New York City, where this, law and order candidate has won the primary, and there's really a change in rhetoric. You can see more and more big news companies coming out with these stories about crime, increased crime rates, and a lot of this rhetoric around law and order and crime is to try and legitimize the police after the huge Black Lives Matter movement, and now with its kind of dormancy, I guess. And so I think that Biden and the Democrats will continue to push this rhetoric and continue to run not only pro-police candidates, because if you're a Democrat, you have to be pro-police at least to some degree, but also candidates who will increase police budgets, decrease accountability, stuff like that. And so we need a mass movement organized by a working class party. That is very clear to many people, that can fight for reforms we need while also building a socialist and trade union movement. Young people support socialism. Young people are being drawn to socialism. The question is, what is the socialism that they're being drawn to? These huge organizations like DSA, they have socialist in the name, but oftentimes they're running as Democratic Party candidates. They're trying to reform the Democratic Party, which we know is a dead end effort. And they have grown, but we have to qualify that with the fact that DSA membership is not. It's very much based on signing up online, giving some money. We really need a membership party, like a mass workers party with membership, which I'll touch on later. But yeah, so basically young people support socialism. Socialism is still popular, but the Squad and Sanders are not socialists. They are Democrats who know what people, particularly young people, want to hear.
Yeah, so I mean, you touched on a couple of important points there. I think, Elisabeth, one is the key question of the need for the building a mass movement in order to conquer, reforms, and then of course the other is that the so-called left around Sanders and the Squad still continues to be remained imprisoned within the Democrats, which is going to impinge upon their ability to be effective, as maybe we'll discuss a little bit later. Now, the other aspect of what we've seen in the US, of course, Trump was defeated, but he still maintained this incredible grip over the Republican Party. I mean, it's commented upon here in much of the media in the UK that you're now dealing with a Republican Party where some years ago it would be inconceivable that it will be the Bushes and the Cheneys that will be seen as the moderate left wing of the Republican Party as a measure of how far to the right that it's gone. But maybe, Jeff, you could outline a few points here. Trump's back on the road, going around really preparing presumably for another run at the presidency later. But what is the real future of the Republican Party itself? Has it been completely Trumpified? Is there the possibility of those in opposition to Trump coming into collision with him? Maybe a split taking place at a certain stage? And, what is the future here for the other party of American capitalism? And that is the Republican Party, which the really serious wing of the capitalist class seem to have largely lost control of, or a big element of that. So maybe Jeff has a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, these are important questions. There's a lot of speculation in the corporate media, and I would say in some discussions of people that pay attention to the corporate parties. Now, Trump is doing those rallies. He's doing some rallies now. I actually know somebody that was trying to get to one that got rained out and then went to another one. It's difficult to actually gauge the numbers, for example. It's not getting much corporate media play, that Trump's rallies. It's not being covered that much. But there is one article I found from Ohio. Didn't get any direct report on this rally, but 20,000 were at a rally in Wellington, Ohio. A couple of things to notice about that is 20,000 is not really that much, if that's accurate in terms of previous rallies that Trump was doing and so on. Trump had a website or something that went nowhere recently. And without the corporate media amplifying those rallies, it's not going to have the impact that Trump's rallies had in the past, which were always big in the past. But anyway, but there are other ones happening or planned to happen. There was one in Florida, couldn't get numbers on that. Where that got covered was mainly from the angle of there was just a disaster of the building collapse, the apartment building collapse in Florida. Why was Trump still having a rally there? Which I think is a legitimate question in a way. So yeah, Trump is like you implied with the question. Trump is getting ready for not just the 2024 presidential elections, probably. Trump has made it clear he wants to run, but also the 2022 congressional elections that are coming up very soon. Republicans are positioning for that. And as far as Trump completely dominating the Republican Party, whether it's the wishes of a portion of the capitalist class or whether it reflects reality, there does seem to be some cracks in the edifice of Trump completely controlling the Republican Party. For example, DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is probably going to run in 2024. That's the latest speculation. A lot could happen between now and then. And of course, Trump doesn't like that. When Trump was in Florida for his rally, DeSantis was not mentioned. DeSantis was not featured, et cetera. So there is this, I don't know if you can call it a wing, but there are Republican so-called moderates. Is a very relative term, like you mentioned, Tony, to call someone like Liz Cheney or Mitt Romney a moderate. But in the context of the Republican Party, there are some so-called moderates that are, not going along with Trump in various ways, but not often not where it really matters. Where it really matters to the Republican Party and their Republican and their backers in the corporations and the super rich is to, keep the Republican Party going, keeping it voting as an opposition party. So there's a lot of votes that you will find unanimity within the Republican Party on. Whether Trump supports that particular vote or not, they will line up behind their leaders below Trump in the Republican Party. But there is those sort of so-called moderates are a minority. It's definite. Liz Cheney, someone like Romney, who, by the way, was the initiated Obamacare, which a lot of people don't know. That's another story. But also Charles Baker, for example, the governor of Massachusetts. You can find Republicans here or there, especially after the January 6th political riot. You can find Republicans distancing themselves from Trump. There was a letter signed by a lot of low-level Republicans saying that they couldn't support Trump. And as far as any kind of split in the Republican Party, it's often threatened, in history, often threatened. Now, Trump himself threatened to start a new party at one point, although Trump was also a Democrat in the past, by the way. But splits are rarely carried out. There's a lot of money going into the Republican Party from the super rich, the corporations, and they don't really want to give up on it. They don't really want to just say, oh yeah, we're going to do this now. The two corporate parties, the Republicans and Democrats, they are structurally embedded in U.S. capitalism now, and they to split from them in a serious way would be a huge undertaking. There are examples. Teddy Roosevelt, way back in early 20th century. Last election cycle, William Weld, Bill Weld, former Republican governor of California, who's considered a moderate, although he's old money, rich capitalist. He ran on the Libertarian Party ticket, a small minor party here, so a right-wing party. So I don't see splits as real right now because the situation's still in play. There's a lot of money behind people like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney that aren't supporting Trump. And you could say there's a fight over control of the Republican Party, and Trump seems to be winning it right now. But there's also a huge amount of invested, literally, in keeping a two-party system going. In fact, even right after the January 6th political riot in Washington, there was still an attempt immediately to rehabilitate the Republican Party from Biden and from Democrats. They literally said, we need two parties. And that's true. They really do need two parties. It's not just bipartisanship by Biden and company is not a tactic. It's not just a political tactic to try to overcome a supposed deficit in votes in the Senate. Actually, there are ways they can get around that the Senate rules, and they choose not to, but that's another story. In terms of bipartisanship, it is an ideological thing, not just a tactical political thing. So right now, the fight of Trump being in control and getting support in the Republican Party is playing out, like I mentioned, the context of the elections coming up in 2022 and 2024. And that is not a done deal. Right now, Trump is sort of campaigning early for the Republicans he's supporting in 2022. And there's not unanimity on that in the Republican Party, which candidates to support in the congressional elections. And doing so, really pushing on law and order issues, really pushing on immigration, really pushing on the stolen election narrative, right? And not all of those things are the wholly owned property of the Republican Party. Pushing on law and order and pushing on immigration, as Elisabeth started to get into with law and order, that's becoming now the switch, the turn from Biden and others in the Democratic Party in terms of getting, positioning for the 2022 congressional elections. There's a distancing from Black Lives Matter and movement and related protests and issues that were brought up to a law and order thing and immigration. Vice President Harris infamously said when she was in Guatemala recently, don't come here, very clearly. And of course, there are divergences in what the two parties are emphasizing right now. Democrats talking about, as Sam went into, COVID victories and whether real or not, and talking about the economy rebounding, whether real or not, that remains to be seen. But Trump and the Republicans won't stress that. So there are definitely differences, but there are some similarities emerging. Republicans are hitting hard on high gas prices, critical race theory as this kind of new thing to connect to the left in various ways. And there's differences between the two parties right now, but they are united on keeping each other alive to a certain extent, despite the rhetoric from Trump. As we talked about in the past, I'll end on this point, Trump is a loose cannon in terms of what a lot of backers of the Republican Party think and what backers of the capitalist class thinks about having the two parties up and running as a duopoly over U.S. politics, the two corporate parties, Republicans and Democrats. So Trump, I would say that Trump's future is more shaky than it seems at times, and that he doesn't completely control the Republican Party, but he is dominating it at this moment. And a split from the Republicans, not ruled out, but not likely, because there's a lot of room within these not really real political parties, not really based on membership or accountability. The Republicans and Democrats at any moment can switch around the charismatic leader figure and prop up a new one and continue with business as usual.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I think you've raised points there really illustrating how extremely fluid and uncertain the situation is, both for Trump, but it's also true that he's still there and the forces are there. And of course, a lot of this for the future, what happens with him, the movements around him partly will depend what happens under the Biden presidency, and how deep a crisis develops with that in the course of the next few years. Plus, of course, and we haven't touched upon this due to time, we have the 2022 elections, as you mentioned, the midterms, and what the Republicans are trying to do there in terms of changing the election system, making it more difficult to vote, basically ballot rigging or gerrymandering in one form or another to try and secure their position. And with such a narrow majority in the House and even Stevens in the Senate, then who knows how it will play out in a very uncertain situation. So once again, we'd like to appeal to our viewers, just to remind you, if you want to get more of our analysis, you can go to our website on socialistworld.net. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel on CWI Media. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist, and you can like our page on Facebook, Socialist World-CWI, and you can even follow us on Instagram at Socialist World. So we've touched here thus far on the domestic situation, really, facing Biden and in the US, where they've not overcome the crisis. As Sam pointed out, you still have very high levels of unemployment compared to what existed pre-pandemic, despite the fact that they have, of course, reduced it from the depths of the crisis which existed earlier. But of course, we've also seen big changes and important developments in relation to the international policy of the US. Biden's come forward with this, came to the G7 looking for what trying to forge some sort of alliance of Democrats. Very strange choice of Democrats or democratic regimes. I don't mean alliance of democratic parties, but of the Democratic Party, an alliance of the democratic regimes and governments around the world against China. And that reflects, of course, this ongoing conflict which exists. I think maybe you could say if there is one bipartisan policy that exists in the US, it's their attitude towards the emergence of China and the threat that poses to the interests of US imperialism. But that poses the whole question of what is Biden's and US imperialism's foreign policy now? What can we expect from that in the course of the next period? And we see quite dramatic changes taking place. The horrors that are going to unfold now in Afghanistan with the troop withdrawal, which really is a defeat for imperialism in many respects. You saw incredible scenes last night where at 3 o'clock in the morning, Bagram Air Base was just abandoned and the lights were switched off. And they didn't even inform the Afghan military that they were leaving, and they've gone. Which incredible state of affairs. But maybe Sam, you can make a few points of what you think of the international policy that we're going to see from Biden and U.S. imperialism in the next period.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Tony. Like Jeff said, the ruling class really viewed Trump as sort of a loose cannon, and that was really one of the reasons that the capitalist class ended up turning on Trump the last election, was that he made American imperialism look really brash and foolish. Biden, on the other hand, is a politician with a long history of carrying out American foreign policy in a so-called respectable manner. However, even though Biden's foreign policy represents a shift away from Trump's foreign policy in tone, in actual policy, they're really quite similar in a lot of ways. Biden's continuing to uphold Trump's sanctions against countries like Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, all of America's other official enemies. The Biden administration, is also continuing to recognize, Juan Guaido as the rightful president of Venezuela, signaling that his administration really is not going to be afraid to coordinate and back coups in Latin America and across the world. Same with all the administrations before him. As well, we saw, I think, as Jeff mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris go to Guatemala and warn people that if they came to the United States border, they'd be turned away. A real, complete reversal of previous comments she made a year ago during the election, where she, criticized Trump for his policy of, not allowing refugees and migrants into the United States. It really clearly showing that the Biden administration is really going to be no friend to refugees from Latin America or from the rest of the world. And so, well, Biden, like you said, has made moves to take the United States, for example, out of the Saudi war in Yemen and out of Afghanistan. The United States continues to be heavily involved in both conflicts. In Afghanistan, for example, they're withdrawing a lot of their troops, from a so-called, offensive role, but are going to keep troops there in a defensive role. And really with the kind of language that they use, that could really mean anything. There have been other examples of the US, so-called withdrawing from different areas, only to have, more troops go in later. All the while there's a real constant, presence of the US military in these countries. And so, the amount of corporate news that we're hearing about these withdrawals is not really indicative of how much the US is going to be disengaging from these conflicts. So there's really nothing to indicate that the US is going to cease any of its military operations, around the globe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. In fact, Biden recently has, launched several airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias in Syria. Really, I think showing that these conflicts are still as active as they were under Trump. And there's no reason to believe that they won't get more active as Biden continues US imperialism. And so, like I said, one of Biden's main roles is to make US imperialism respectable again. So that means strengthening the US's relationship with its allies who felt alienated under Trump, and really continuing to rattle the saber at Russia and China in particular. Part of showing that America is back is also increasing the strength of the US military. So Biden's 2020 budget that he's published has already shown that he's planning on increasing the US military budget by about $20 trillion. So I think really when you compare that to, for example, we're talking about his infrastructure bill. The estimates I've seen for how much that's going to end up costing after the two bills go through is maybe around $6 trillion at, its most expensive. So, really pennies compared to the $20 trillion that, are probably definitely going to go through. And this is going towards, upgrading and buying more nuclear weapons, more ships, more aircrafts. Interestingly, a lot of the aircrafts that he's planning on buying in the 2022 budget are really experimental aircrafts, which, the military has done studies on it, and they really don't work. So it really is just, $20 trillion being given right to the pockets of the arms dealers and the weapons manufacturers. And, these $20 trillion could really do unprecedented things if they were put towards social services, if they were put towards, a real infrastructure bill that, prioritized actually fighting climate change, public transportation. But of course, instead it's going to the military industrial complex. And like you mentioned, Tony, Biden is, certainly looking to confront China. Recently, he made a promise that China would not surpass the US as the global superpower on his watch. But this is the same Biden who, a year ago during the presidential primary, dismissed the idea that China could ever pose a threat to the US. So Biden has definitely taken a more hostile orientation to China since taking office. And I think you see that, reflected in the corporate media as well. Recently, we saw the corporate media, publishing articles about how, COVID-19 could have come from a Chinese lab. these were the same corporate media which, laughed at Trump when he suggested the same thing. So clearly trying to, get people angry, at China. And so Biden's way to deal with China seems to be, like I mentioned before, really restoring the legitimacy of American power on the world stage, investing in even more advanced military technology, and attempting to strengthen its alliances that, may have faltered a bit under Trump's administration. And so the Biden White House has been framing the conflict between the US and China as a battle between the so-called democratic world and the autocratic world, lumping in Iran, Russia, China into that sort of authoritarian world. What's really an attempt by Biden to preserve American hegemony and stability for the capitalist class is really being draped, at least in the US, in the corporate media, being draped in talk of freedom, democracy, liberty for the whole world. But of course, this supposed battle between democracy and authoritarianism, is really just a distraction from, the true conflict that is going on, which is between, the global working class, and the global capitalist class with the U.S. at its head. And so I think that, we'll see how things develop, but the U.S. Under Biden is certainly looking to, confront China and try and, really contain it.
No, I think you raised important points there, Sam, which maybe we can come back to in a future broadcast for future discussions, because we are dealing here, of course, with this decline historically of US imperialism and the emergence of China, and probably the points you made there about Biden switching his stance, in the prime is dismissing any threat of China, and now recognizing the threat of China represents him coming to terms with the reality of the situation and the pressure that the capitalist class has undoubtedly put on him to try and deal with the issue of China itself. And I mean, obviously, if you're in military arms production, increase in the military expenditure, which they are going to do, then obviously you're going to make a massive increase in profits. I mean, whether they're going to be able to go in militarily in the same way they can have the rockets and aeroplanes, whether they can put the boots on the ground around the world is, a more complicated issue. Certainly interventions a la Iraq, I think, because of the political position and the weakening of US imperialism. And I mean, we can come back to some of these issues maybe to discuss in the world situation, but I mean, certainly in Afghanistan, they're creating, with the victory of the Taliban, looking increasingly a possibility, a really dangerous position for global capitalism, in terms of the basis being laid for a resurgence of other Islamic groups, etc. But anyway, those are some of the points we can come back to and maybe explore further in future CWI broadcasts. Now, Elisabeth, maybe you, because you touched earlier on the question of the need for a mass workers' party of a socialist character. Now, what are the prospects of that in the course of the next few years? And maybe you could bring us up to speed with what's happened with the Howie Hawkins and his campaign following the last presidential elections, which ISG gave support to, lent support to his candidacy. So what's the prospects now for the emergence of a new Workers' Party? And are there any discussions and initiatives developing around that at this stage?
I think we can be optimistic about a new Workers' Party, or at least the foundations of it forming within the next couple of years. I think working people are very tired of the status quo, and the two corporate parties have lost legitimacy, have lost the trust of the majority of the working class. Austerity, climate change, bailouts for big business, and excuses for not really changing anything has left people looking for alternatives to the Republicans and the Democrats. And, really what this working class party needs to be is by and for working people with absolutely no corporate money, and with internal democracy. And both of these things, the Republicans and the Democrats do not have. So, internal democracy would mean actually having a say in who runs, in what the platform is, having the ability to recall people. And that doesn't exist within the Democratic Party, which is one reason among many why it's impossible for it to be reformed. So, that kind of brings me to nationally the biggest effort for something to the left of the Democrats, for building something to the left of the Democrats, is Movement for a People's Party, which was started by one of Sanders's campaign staffers, Nick Branna. But unfortunately, Movement for a People's Party does not have a clear class character and does not have a clear program. And though in the name it says Movement for a People's Party, it's still unclear whether that party that they're trying to build would be independent of the Democrats, and it's looking more likely that the answer to that is not really, because they are still doing the inside-outside strategy that DSA does of supporting Democrats on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, they support Nina Turner, even though she's running as a Democrat. So it's unlikely that Movement for a People's Party will turn into a People's Party, unfortunately. But in terms of the Green Party, the Green Party is one of the largest quote unquote third parties next to the Libertarian Party. But it's very federalized, so it kind of varies from state to state. And it's hard to tell where all of the different state parties are at. But we do know that Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker are doing they're calling it a Green Socialist Organizing Project, which they've launched after their campaign. Until recently, it was mainly social media, but now it's developing more of an internal life with membership structures and democratic processes within, which is definitely a step in the right direction. An organization like this is much more likely to, be part of this, the way that we're imagining a workers' party coming together as many streams forming a big river. So, this could be an important stream in that, would help form this workers' party. So Hawkins and Walker, who ran as the Green Party candidates in 2020, are both socialists, and I believe they're both members of the Teamsters. They won the nomination of the party, though that was not without a struggle. They campaigned, and now they're continuing to organize after the election, which is key. And it's not just organizing after the election for the next election, like it is with many Democrats or Republicans. They are, organizing around issues, and they have the goal of transforming the Green Party into something more clearly socialist in character, which is good. I believe in 2016, the Green Party adopted an anti-capitalist clause, which again is a step in the right direction. So, whether it's the Green Socialist Organizing Project or some other effort, it has to be organized around a common program, a common socialist program with a clear vision of what socialism is, what the goal of this party would be, with a clear class character and program. And this party, would have to adopt democratic structures, as I said. And within the Green Party, this Green Socialist Organizing Project really should, I think, be producing its own material, challenging the right wing and the conspiracy wing of the Green Party at state conventions and on the national level with alternate leadership slates and resolutions. But I also think that this group should organize in a way that's not just restricted to within the Green Party, because in this process of getting this group off the ground, it may become clear that the Green Party can't be transformed, and that young workers can't be attracted to the Green Party banner, and then they would have to take their fight outside of that party to a broader group, which is kind of what we're more imagining it would be many streams forming a larger river. So, I think the left of the Green Party needs to account for their members that are inside of unions, form a labor caucus of some sort to make that more robust, to make a more coordinated union approach. But, I think projects like this are really important, and show that there is a seriousness on the left about forming a workers' party, that previously we hadn't really seen with groups like DSA, for example.
Right. Well, that's important point. So really, the issues in a tentative way, in a sense, beginning to emerge with what Howie Hawkins' group is doing, trying to get a socialist opposition organised. But it's really part of an ongoing process that's there. Obviously, objectively, it's implicit in the situation, the need for a new party, but it's the actual giving birth to it is going to, be a product of the struggles that are going to develop and people passing through experience, and then initiatives, important initiatives being taken maybe in some key states. Which brings us to the final point, which I think we should conclude this discussion on. In all of the opinion polls that have been published, the United States stands out for one thing, and that is the issue of increased support for socialism, the idea of socialism, at least amongst young people. It's over 50%, I think, in the recent poll that I saw, indicated that they supported the idea of socialism. And by the way, I was watching a discussion program with American commentators on Al Jazeera the other day, and they made a very important point that in the next presidential elections, the largest voting bloc of age-wise will be Generation Z. In other words, very young people, which is going to be a crucial question as these battles unfold. So maybe, Jeff, in conclusion, you could explain how is this idea of support for socialism being manifested as an idea, and what implications does it have for the future?
Yeah, sure, Tony, thanks. The support for socialism in the US, the increased support for it's not an accident at all. It's based on really material conditions, the way people are forced to live here. The majority of people, living standards for most people have been falling since, the mid 70s, really. But that accelerated with the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, and its aftermath. The recent boom that Trump tried to, claim as his own and so on and run on, just hollow for most people in the U.S. and that's well known. It's contradictory because someone like Trump, for example, can then tap into other issues that people, sort of misdirection away from the system and the capitalist class. But basically, support for socialism, and that's defined in different ways by different people, of course, is increasing because things are getting worse for most people. And the so-called COVID recession, or the recession that was already in formation but was accelerated by COVID, the whole idea of like essential workers. Yeah, they're essential workers, but go in and risk your life in the meatpacking plants, go in and risk your life in the stores. That's a choice a lot of working people faced. And there's been an increase in working class protest, here and there. It's, not a national way, except for participation in the BLM movement in last spring, last summer. But you can feel more political energy, especially prior to the election, to fight back against what COVID is doing, what was doing to people, the recession was doing to people. That's palpable, and there's been a lot of union stuff going on, that a lot of union militancy that doesn't get reported on and doesn't necessarily represent a huge increase in union members or strikes, but there is somewhat of an increase, and more people are aware of it. So if you want to start tracking socialism getting more popular, you really have to go back, I think, to around 2011, where polls started to consistently track from 2011 to the poll you mentioned, Tony, a very recent poll in June, increased support for socialism. Now, there's times where that accelerates, the support becomes deeper, and you can see it more obviously. The most recent report or poll was an Axios Momentum poll, it's called, and it had some really interesting things in it, like you alluded to. It had support increasing among youth, among young people for socialism, an increasingly negative view of capitalism, even among adults. One statistic, socialism, 58% in 2019, 58% of Americans aged 18 to 34 reacted positively to the word capitalism. That's gone down to 49%, almost 10 percentage points. In other words, and this is true of a lot of aspects of this recent poll and previous polls, attitudes towards capitalism in a positive way, even among Republicans, is going down. And now how that translates exactly into socialism, or for example, the latest poll, socialism has, quote, positive connotations for 60% of Black Americans, 45% of American women, and 33% of non-white Republicans even. And these numbers have grown for over the past 2 years. And also, support for socialism among adults has increased, not just among youth. But there's a lot of in that recent poll, and a lot of the reporting, there wasn't much, but some of the reporting that went out on that recent poll, the Axios Momentum poll, in social media, but also even in the corporate media a little bit, sort of ended with the tagline that hey, socialism used to be a negative thing, a pejorative thing, and now it's a badge of honor that people are saying, I'm a socialist. They say it with pride. Now, you can't say that's happening everywhere at all times, certainly, but it seems to be a trend based, again, on polling data from 2011 through 2021. A lot of polls show increased support for socialism, less support for capitalism. And of course, that's based on the way people are forced to live. What that implies for the future is really some of what Elisabeth was getting into, that there are obstacles. It's not a straight line. Right now, there's a shift in the mood. At least there's an attempt to shift the mood from the corporate media, from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, away from the mass movement that was on the streets last year, Black Lives Matter movement and related protests, which didn't just confine themselves completely to immediately issues of police brutality and racism. There were a lot of people making connections to larger issues about capitalism and the economy and the way it's put forward here in the corporate media, the inequity of the system, or the system not being equitable. Really, it's about equality and the lack of equality in the U.S. and deepening inequality in the U.S. I think it's getting pretty well known that the billionaire class, if you want to call it that, that's kind of inaccurate, but the number of billionaires is increasing rapidly in the U.S. The gulf between the super rich and working people, broadly defined, is growing and growing, especially during COVID, actually. So if the idea of socialism is going to grow, if socialism as an organized force is going to grow, there are, of course, some obstacles that are not easy to overcome, as Elisabeth started to get into. Breaking people breaking away themselves from the Democratic Party is key. Starting to organize some sort of workers' party is key, a mass left workers' party, especially, but even a progressive workers' party would be a step in the right direction. And that won't be an even process, it'll be a complicated process, but it's absolutely necessary. And of course, the role of the unions, even unions in a weakened state here in the U.S., have to play a key role in building a workers' party, at least some unions. And right now, where there are incredibly important union movements happening, the Teamsters in their recent convention saying we're going to organize Amazon. We're not going to do it through National Labor Relations Board elections. We're going to do it through strike action. We're going to do it through pressure. Having right here where I'm speaking from, near Worcester, Massachusetts, in New England, there's one of the longest strikes in state history, the second longest strike in state history, of 800 nurses on strike. But a common theme, whether it's the recent Amazon election in Bessemer or the nurses' strike, is unions still tend to go it alone with old business unionist concepts about jurisdiction and craft and professionalism and all this other stuff, when it's key right now. We need the labor movement to unify at the point of attack, wherever that might be, Amazon or in important strikes, and that's not quite happening. So organizing a workers' party, even the foundations of it, strengthening and democratizing the labor movement, even sections of it. These things are pressing right now, and there is not a lot of pressure from the small left of the United States to move on these issues. Some left groups like ISG, socialist groups like ISG, Independent Socialist Group, are moving in that direction. Of course, we've already been fighting for these things in our way, and there are other groups that do fight for these things. But the recent elections, what existed for leadership in the Black Lives Matter movement, channeled everything in the 2020 elections in November, before that even, into supporting Biden and local Democratic Party candidates. And that demobilized and took off the streets a movement that could have grown beyond even the size that it took at that time. And so the old saying on the left, the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements, is played out again and again in US politics in different ways, and not always with the same effectiveness. But it's still an obstacle. It's still something that we have to break through in the US in terms of the socialist movement, such as it exists, in terms of the left in general. There is that pressure always for politics, meaning independent from the Democrats and Republicans and the capitalist class. But that pressure has to take an organized form, and those forces are scattered and small right now in the US. And I don't mean that in a depressing or demoralizing way, because the objective conditions of the economy, and also what a lot of people, the conclusions they come to in different ways, tens and hundreds of millions often not voting in the US. And abstention is not what we advocate. We advocate trying to find independent left candidates where possible to vote for, run candidates where possible, from a socialist perspective and socialist organizing standpoint, but that's not always in existence, and people aren't always aware of it, and so they vote with their feet, or they vote with not walking to the voting place, and that's important to keep in mind, that there's always this push for independent politics in the U.S., but there's only certain times where it takes an organizational form, and we're doing everything we can to help that organizational form of class politics, socialist politics, start again to become a mass force in the U.S. And that's not a given, but the opportunities are there now, and they will increase, as I think Elisabeth mentioned, especially in the context. We're going to see lesser evilism reemerge in 2022 elections. That's definite, and 2024. But what the time frame, how long people will tolerate that, is another question. And if you're really down in the grassroots in the U.S., a lot of people find that situation intolerable. They can't live this way anymore.
Well, that's the key point, Jeff, and I think it's an optimistic note to finish on in terms of the discussion we've had today. It's not going to be in a straight line, but there are big opportunities to win support for the ideas of real socialism, and of course to clarify what socialism means for those who indicate that they support it. So I'd like to thank our guests today, Jeff, Elisabeth and Sam. I think we've had a good introductory discussion to the situation unfolding in the US under the Biden administration. I'd like to remind our viewers, if you want to read more of our analysis on the US or elsewhere, you could go to the CWI website at socialistworld.net. You could go to the Independent Socialist Group website as well and follow what they're doing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, CWI Media. And of course, we'd like your support, not just passively, but actively. If you're watching in a country where there are no forces of the CWI, then get in contact with us at our website. If you're in a country where we do have affiliates and supporters, then also contact us and join the struggle. And at the very least, why not go to our website and hit the donate button and make a donation to assist us in the work that we're doing in trying to build a larger socialist international organization to fight with capitalism. So I thank you all for watching, and we'll be back in the future to discuss other aspects of the global struggle against capitalism and for a socialist alternative.